Hi, this is Annie from Hoop Sisters, and in this video we're going to do another applique border block. It's going to be A5H6 and A6H5. So join me as we take a look at all the supplies we'll need. Okay, some of the supplies we'll need for this block is some Wonder Tape, double-sided water-soluble tape. When our block is finished, we'll need our Trimmer by George 2.0. We are also going to need some brand of temporary spray adhesive to attach the back of the block to the back of the hoop. And we have a couple different hoop scissors here, our original hoop scissors and our hoop scissors mini, which will really come in handy for the applique portion of this block. Other supplies that we're going to need is a water-soluble thread. We like to use the Vanish Light, an embroidery bobbin thread, and our threads that we're going to use for this, we need 4 threads. I am going to be using 3 threads on this block, and the reason is this is going to be my thread A and B. Our thread A needs to be contrasting to our fabric one, so my fabric one is a purple. So that orange is actually a good contrasting fabric for that. And my thread 2, or my fabric 2, is this orange piping, which has to match. So it just so happened the fabric that I picked out, I'm going to use the same thread A and thread B. I also need my thread C, which is going to be matching my fabric 3, which is my gray, and also my thread D. And I have matching bobbins for all of those. And this is going to be my fabric 1. And my fabric 2 is the optional piping. We're going to stitch out the piping so you can see how that's done. That would be the version A of the blocks. This is my gray here is my fabric 3, which I'm going to use for the applique as well as for another portion of the block. This is my fabric 4, and I'll use the purple for my backing fabric. And of course I already have my battleizer hooped, and our battleizer of course is our batting stabilizer combination. So we're going to go with our step 1, where we're going to just put a neutral thread in the needle and just an embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin to get started. And we'll stitch an outline to the pattern onto the design, right onto the battleizer. For step 2, you're going to place fabric 4, and this is for version A and version B. You're going to put water-soluble thread in the needle only, and the machine will sew tack down stitches. And it will sew a little bit slightly different for version A and version B based on whether we're doing the flange or not. Now, anywhere on the outside of the block, you're going to trim a 1/2 inch. Any area on the inside of the block, you're going to trim a scant 1/4 inch. For step 3, we're going to continue with water-soluble thread in the needle if we're doing version A, and here I'm showing you how to do version A. We're taking water-soluble double-sided tape, Wonder Tape, and we have placed it where we want the piping to go. And the piping folded edge is going to line right up on the basting stitch that's stitched out. And so we're going to go ahead and place that and then trim, leaving it about 1/2 inch. And if you have any section of the piping that is sticking up, just put another little piece of Wonder Tape in there and pull the paper off to help hold it in place. Now you can see me putting the piping along the top curve, and again the folded edge will be placed right along the basting stitch. And the Wonder Tape will definitely hold it in place. And this is if you're doing version A. If you're doing version B, you're going to put thread B in the needle only, and the machine will sew out a decorative stitch. But for the piping like we're doing, the water-soluble thread, it will just stitch a basting stitch to hold that piping in place. For step 4, you're going to place fabric 1 and 3 right side up on the right side of the block. And with water-soluble thread in the needle only, you're going to sew the tack down stitches. Both versions will stitch the same, with the exception of version A will stitch another piping placement line. And then you can trim a 1/4 inch on the inside of the block and leave a 1/2 inch on the outside of the block. The area that is stitched right up by the piping, you are going to trim that as though you're going to be stitching for machine applique. When you get to the end of this section, you're going to have to clip a couple basting stitch to cut out the fabric. For step 5, you're going to place thread D in the needle only, and it's going to sew the satin stitches. For step 6, you're going to place thread A in the needle only and sew the decorative stitch. For step 7, on version A, you're going to continue with the water-soluble thread, and you're going to place a prepared piping, which is your fabric 2, and the machine will sew a tack-down stitch. If you're sewing version B, you're going to place thread B in the needle only and sew the decorative stitches. For step 8, you're going to place fabric 4 right side up on the left side of the block, and with water-soluble thread still in the needle, you're going to sew the tack-down stitches. On the outside of the block, you're going to trim to leave about a 1/2 inch of fabric, and on the inside of the block, you're going to trim right up to the stitching. For step 9, you're going to place thread D in the needle only and sew the satin stitches. For step 10, you're going to place thread A in the needle only and sew the decorative stitches. And now for step 11, place water-soluble thread in the needle only and the machine stitches a placement stitch. Step 12, continue with water-soluble thread, place fabric 3, and the machine will sew a tack-down stitch, and then you can use the Hoop Scissors Mini to trim right up close to the stitching. For step 13, place thread D in the needle only and sew the embroidery. For step 14, place thread A in the needle only and sew the satin stitches. For step 15, place thread B in the needle only and sew the decorative stitches. For step 16, you're going to place water-soluble thread in the needle only and spray the wrong side of your backing fabric, and you're going to adhere it to the back of your hoop. And then you're going to take it to the machine, and the machine will sew a basting stitch to hold that in place. For step 17, you're going to place thread B in the needle and the bobbin and sew the decorative stitches. Now that the backing fabric is on the back of the hoop, before we begin sewing anything, we are going to do a needle up and needle down and bring the bobbin thread to the top. We're also going to turn off an automatic thread cutter if you have that feature on your machine, and it'll make for a much nicer, cleaner looking back. For step 18, place thread D in the needle and bobbin and stitch the quilting designed and digitized by Sharon Schomburg. Step 19, you're going to place thread A in the needle and bobbin and sew the quilting designed by Sharon. Step 20, place thread C in the needle and bobbin and sew the quilting designed and digitized by Sharon Schomburg.